The summer Cecily turned 24, she learned that silence had a sound. It was the sound of a man eating at the far end of a long table, not looking up. Not once in 3 years had Roland Marsh looked up. She had noticed it first on their wedding night, when he'd sat in the chair by the window of the inn at Harper's Creek and read his correspondence by candlelight, until she fell asleep waiting. She was 19 then, the second daughter of a merchant family in Fredericksburg, whose debts had grown larger than their pride. Roland was 31, the owner of a tannery and 200 acres in the Shenandoah foothills, and he had needed a wife in the way a man needs a coat, functionally, without sentiment. Her father had shaken his hand in the parlor on a Tuesday afternoon, and by the following spring Cecily was Mrs. Marsh, keeper of a house she had never seen until the day she moved into it. The house was called Grayhill. It sat at the end of a long drive lined with oak trees that in autumn turned a color so beautiful, it almost made her forget what the inside felt like. The inside felt like a place where someone had once intended to be happy, and then thought better of it. The rooms were clean. The larder was stocked. The fireplaces drew well in winter. There was nothing wrong with any of it. That was the particular cruelty of it. There was nothing wrong with any of it. Roland was not a cruel man. He had never raised his voice at her, never raised his hand, never spoken to her with anything resembling contempt. He was simply absent in the way that a window is absent from a wall that has only ever had brick. You could not miss what had never been there. Or so she told herself, on the nights she lay in the dark, listening to his breathing from the other side of the bed, wondering if this was simply what marriage was, and whether every woman in every house in every county was staring at the ceiling way she was. She cooked his meals and pressed his shirts and kept the household accounts and planted a kitchen garden in the side yard that by the second summer was producing more than they could eat. She put up preserves. She mended fences. She learned, by necessity, to doctor the livestock when the hired man was away. She did all of this without being asked, and Roland accepted all of it without comment, and the years passed in the way that long roads pass when there is no landmark in sight. You know you are moving, but you cannot say toward what. She had tried in the beginning. She had asked him questions at dinner about the tannery, about the men who worked there, about what he thought of the new road being laid through the valley. He answered in the way he answered everything, briefly, sufficiently, and then not again. She had tried once, in their second year, to tell him about a book she had been reading, a novel that had made her cry in the kitchen over her mending, and he had looked at her across the table, with an expression that was not unkind so much as genuinely bewildered, as though he could not quite understand why she was saying words to him in the evening, when the day's work was done. After that she stopped trying. She was not a woman who needed to be told something twice. What she did instead was read. She read everything she could find. Roland's small collection of agricultural texts, the novels she borrowed from the minister's wife in town, a battered encyclopedia that lived on the shelf in the back bedroom and which she had worked through twice, cover to cover. She read in the evenings when Roland sat with his ledgers, and she read in the mornings before he was awake, and sometimes she read in the barn on winter afternoons, with a horse blanket over her knees and a book propped on the rail, and in those hours she felt something that she could only call herself. A person who existed, who thought things, who wanted things. She had not, until her third autumn at Grayhill, understood how dangerous that feeling could be. It was an October evening, and the oak trees on the drive were at their peak, burning orange and gold in the late afternoon light. Roland had 2 men from town come to the house to discuss a contract. She had set out whiskey and cold meat in the parlor, and then retreated to the kitchen to finish the bread she had started that morning. The kitchen door was not fully latched. She had not noticed. She was not listening. She was shaping the loaves, flouring her hands, thinking about nothing in particular, when she heard her name. It came through the gap in the door like something cold. Just her name, and then laughter. Mrs. Marsh, she's a capable woman. A pause. The sound of a glass being set down. Capable. Roland's voice. She had heard that voice every day for 3 years, and she knew every texture of it. This texture was one she had not heard before. Capable is one word for it. I'd say she works like a field hand, and reads like a schoolmarm, and talks like she expects to be answered. Efficient enough, for what she is. More laughter. Easy laughter. The laughter of men in a warm room, who have had their whiskey, and are comfortable, and have no reason to lower their voices, because it has never occurred to them that someone might be standing 10 feet away with flour on her hands, and 3 years of goodwill settling like ash. She doesn't give you trouble. Not that kind. A pause. The kind she gives is the talking kind. Can't seem to understand that a man comes home from a day's work to rest, not to hear about some novel. She set the bread down very carefully on the board. She did not cry. She was surprised to find she did not cry. What she felt instead was something much quieter and much more final than tears. A kind of settling. The way a door settles into a frame when someone presses it closed for the last time. She stood at the kitchen table with her hands still covered in flour, and she understood, with perfect clarity, that she had been waiting 3 years for something that was never going to happen, and that she had known it, really, from the beginning, and had simply refused to know that she knew it. She looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she washed them. She did not go back into the parlor. She went upstairs instead, to the bedroom that smelled like cedar from the chest at the foot of the bed, and she opened the top drawer of the bureau and removed the small bundle she had kept there, wrapped in a piece of cloth cut from an old petticoat. It was not much. She had saved it herself, quietly, over 18 months, from the household money, a little here, a little there, in the way that women learn to save when they understand that saving might someday be necessary. $34 and some change. A brooch that had been her grandmother's, which she might sell if she had to. A letter she had written, and never sent to her older sister in Charlottesville, which she now folded and tucked into her coat pocket. Not because she planned to send it, but because it was the only thing she had ever written that told the truth about her life, and it felt wrong to leave it behind. She put on her second-best dress, because her best would be missed. She put on her wool coat and her sturdiest boots. She looked once around the room. The cedar chest, the bureau, the window overlooking the side yard, and the kitchen garden she had planted, and tended, and would not see through another winter, and she felt, briefly, an ache so specific it had a shape. Then she went downstairs. The voices were still in the parlor. She could hear them as she passed the closed door. She paused there for just a moment, her hand not touching the wood, and she thought about opening it. She thought about what she would say if she did. She was surprised to find she had nothing to say. There was, it turned out, nothing she wanted from that room. Not an explanation, not an apology, not even the satisfaction of an expression on Roland Marsh's face. She simply wanted to no longer be in the house. She went out through the kitchen. She left the bread rising on the board. Outside, the October air was cold and sharp and smelled of wood smoke from somewhere up the ridge. The oak trees stood in the fading light like sentinels who had seen this before and were not surprised. She walked down the drive without looking back, and the sound of her boots on the dry leaves was the loudest sound in the world. She walked for 2 hours before anyone saw her. The road to town was 4 miles, and she knew it well enough to walk it in the dark, which was good because by the time she was halfway there the light was gone entirely, and she was navigating by the pale strip of road and the memory of every stone and rut. She was cold. She had not thought carefully enough about how cold it would be, walking at night in October, and she understood now why the woman in the book she had read last winter had nearly died of exposure before she was found. The books always skipped that part. The physical, grinding reality of simply being cold. She was thinking about this, specifically, about the difference between reading about hardship and standing inside it, when she heard the wagon. It was coming from the direction of town, moving slowly, a single lantern swinging on the front post. She stepped to the side of the road, and the wagon slowed and stopped, and the man on the seat looked down at her, with the particular expression of a person who has encountered something unexpected, and is deciding what to do about it. He was older, 60 or so, with a face weathered to the color of good leather and eyes that were, she noticed immediately, neither calculating nor afraid. He looked at her the way a man looks at a situation that requires solving. "You all right?" he said. "I'm walking to town," she said. He looked at the dark road behind her, then at her coat, then at her face. "It's near on 9 o'clock, I'm aware." Another pause. He reached down and moved a sack of something from the bench beside him. "I've got room if you want it." His name was Mr. Connolly. He was a widower who kept a farm 12 miles north and came to town on Fridays to sell eggs and buy flour, which was exactly what he appeared to be and nothing more. He did not ask her where she was coming from or what she was running toward. He talked, instead, about the road, about a bridge that had washed out the previous spring and still had not been properly repaired, about the way the deer came down from the ridge in October and could startle a horse badly if you weren't watching. He talked about these things in the quiet, even way of a man who has spent many years alone and has learned to fill silence without demanding anything from it. And she sat beside him on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was simply being allowed to exist without being evaluated. He left her at the edge of town with a nod and a suggestion that the boarding house on Millbrook Street was run by a woman named Mrs. Patton who was decent and would not ask unnecessary questions. She thanked him. He clicked to the horse and the lantern disappeared around the corner, and she stood alone on the dark street of a town she had only ever come to for supplies, and she thought, this is where it begins. Mrs. Patton was 60, broad-shouldered, and entirely unsurprised by a woman arriving alone at her door at 9:30 in the evening with a coat and no trunk. She looked at Cecily for a moment with the practiced assessment of a woman who has seen most of what the world sends to a boarding house door. And then she said, supper's done but there's bread and cold chicken. $1 a week, room and board, paid on Sundays. I'll take it, Cecily said. The room was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the back garden where Mrs. Patton grew cabbages. There was a washstand, a narrow bed with a good quilt, a hook on the back of the door for a coat. Cecily sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight, and ate the bread and chicken that Mrs. Patton had brought up on a plate, and she felt, underneath the cold and the tiredness and the specific soreness of 4 miles of road, something that it took her a while to name. It was so unfamiliar she had to sit with it for several minutes before she recognized it. It was relief. She lay down that night without washing the road dust off her boots, which she set neatly by the door, and she pulled the quilt up to her chin and looked at the ceiling of the small clean room, and she thought about what she had, and what she needed and what she was going to do. She had $34 and a brooch. She had 3 years of practical knowledge, housekeeping, accounts, livestock, preserving, the kitchen garden. She had read more than most people she knew, which was not money but was, she had come to believe, something. She needed work. She needed, eventually, more than a boarding house room. She needed to understand, as clearly as possible, the shape of the life that was now in front of her. The laws of Virginia in the year 1821 were not kind to women in her situation. She knew this without having to be told. A wife was, in most legal senses, the property of her husband. Her earnings belonged to him. Her contracts required his consent, and the possibility of divorce, while not impossible, required an act of the legislature and grounds that were difficult to establish and more difficult to prove. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She had read enough to know that the world she lived in had been built by men to suit men, and that this was not a problem she was going to solve in a boarding house room in October. What she could solve was tomorrow. She fell asleep before she finished the thought. Mrs. Patton, she discovered over the following days, was a woman of considerable practical intelligence, who had been running her boarding house alone for 11 years, since her husband had died of a fever and left her with the property, a small debt, and 3 boarders. She had paid the debt, and added 2 more rooms, and now kept 5 boarders and a kitchen garden and a reputation for the best breakfast biscuits in the county, which she made without apparent effort every morning at 5 o'clock. She was not a sentimental woman. She was also, Cecily came to understand, exactly the kind of woman who recognized another woman trying to stay afloat and was willing, without making a production of it, to help. On Cecily's 4th morning, Miss Patton set a second cup of coffee on the kitchen table and sat down across from her and said, "You can write a clear hand?" "Yes," Cecily said. "The dry goods man on the corner keeps his accounts in a state that would make a sane person weep. His wife used to do them, and she died in the spring. He's been asking around for someone to come in twice a week." Cecily looked at her. "You think he'd hire a woman?" "I think he's desperate," Mrs. Patton said. "Which is better?" Mr. Aldrich was, in fact, desperate. He was a small, worried man, whose inventory had been increasingly chaotic since April, and who had recently discovered a discrepancy of $11 in his summer accounts that he could not explain, and that was causing him significant distress. Cecily spent her first afternoon in his back room going through 6 months of ledgers, and by the end of it she had found the $11. It was a simple arithmetic error, repeated across 3 entries, and corrected 4 other smaller errors he hadn't noticed yet. Mr. Aldrich looked at the corrected figures with an expression of such profound relief that she almost felt sorry for him. 2 days a week, he said. Tuesdays and Fridays. $8 a month. 10, she said. And I'll do your quarterly inventory as well. He blinked. 9.10, she said pleasantly. And I'll have it finished before the month is out. He paid her $10. She also, through Mrs. Patton's connections, found a second piece of work, copying correspondence for a lawyer named Mr. Hargrove, who had more clients than he had time to write letters for, and who was willing to pay by the page for clean, accurate work. It was not exciting. It was, in the specific sense that mattered most, money. She had been in town for 3 weeks when the letter arrived. She knew Roland's handwriting. She had seen it on the household ledgers for 3 years. And she stood in the narrow hallway of the boarding house, with the envelope in her hand for a long moment before she opened it. It was brief. It said that she had left without his permission and without his knowledge, and that he expected her to return, and that if she did not he would be forced to take steps. It did not say what steps. It did not say, she noticed, that he wanted her back. It said he expected her to return, which was a different thing entirely, the language of a man who was inconvenienced, not a man who was grieving. She set the letter on her washstand and looked at it for 2 days. Then she went to see Mr. Hargrove. She did not, she explained carefully, need him to represent her. She needed him to tell her what she was, and was not legally entitled to do. Mr. Hargrove was a thin man in his 50s, with a careful face, and a habit of pressing his fingertips together when he was thinking. He listened to her without interrupting, which she appreciated. The law was not on her side, he said, but it was not as entirely against her as she might fear. She had left of her own accord, which meant she had given up the protection of the marital home, but she could not be forcibly returned. Roland could pursue legal separation, or in extreme circumstances divorce, but such proceedings were lengthy and public and expensive, and in his experience men in Roland Marsh's position preferred quiet. The tannery had a reputation to maintain. Proceedings in the legislature were a matter of public record. Essentially, she said, he would have to want his dignity more than he wants to be right. Essentially, Mr. Hargrove said. She thought about this for several days. She thought about Roland in the parlor with his whiskey and his easy laughter and his entirely uncomplicated certainty that she would come back, because what else would she do? She thought about the 3 years of meals and accounts and pressed shirts. She thought about the kitchen garden that would winter over without her and probably survive regardless, because she had planted it well. She wrote him back. It took her 4 drafts to say what she wanted to say, in the way she wanted to say it, without anger, without pleading, without any of the emotions that he would likely dismiss. She told him that she did not intend to return. She told him that she was working and was able to support herself, and did not require anything from him. She told him that she understood the legal situation, and was prepared to proceed in whatever manner he chose to pursue, but that she would like, for both their sakes, to handle this quietly, and with some degree of decency. She did not tell him she had heard him through the kitchen door. She did not tell him how the bread had smelled, rising on the board in the house she had kept for 3 years. Some things were not his to have. His reply came 2 weeks later. It said that he had spoken to his own attorney, and that a formal separation was being arranged, and that she should not expect any portion of the property. She had not expected any portion of the property. She had, in fact, expected less than this, and she sat with the letter and felt something that was almost like gratitude. Not toward him, but toward the version of herself who had walked out of that kitchen without knowing what came next and had found out anyway. The first winter alone was harder than she had expected, and easier than she had feared. The room at Mrs. Patton's was warm, and the biscuits were good, and she had her books and her accounts, and the quiet rhythm of days that were entirely her own, which was a thing she had not known she wanted so badly until she had it. She was lonely sometimes, she would not pretend otherwise. There were evenings when she sat by her window with a book open in her lap, and not reading, watching the lamplight in the window of the house across the street, and wondering about the people inside. Whether they were happy, whether happiness was a thing that simply happened to some people and not others. Or whether it was, like the kitchen garden, a thing you had to plant deliberately in ground you had first prepared. She was thinking about this one February evening when Mrs. Patton knocked on her door and told her that a woman had come asking for a room. A young woman with a baby, and a carpetbag, and a look that Miss Patton recognized and which did not require explaining. Her name was Delia. She was 21. The baby was 4 months old and was called Ruth, a name too solemn for a baby so small but which suited her in some way that became clearer over time. Delia had come from a farm 12 miles east, and had walked most of the way carrying the baby and the carpetbag, and she had blisters on her hands from where the bag's handle had cut through her gloves. And she sat in the kitchen eating bread and cold chicken in the way of someone who has not eaten a real meal in several days. Cecily sat across from her and did not ask questions. She simply poured more coffee and passed the butter, and let the silence be what it was. After a while Delia said, "I didn't know where else to go." "This is a good place to start," Cecily said. She helped Delia the way she had been helped, practically, without sentiment. She introduced her to Mrs. Patton and helped her negotiate a rate for the room. She sat with her one afternoon and helped her write a letter to her sister in another county. because Delia's writing was uncertain, and the words she wanted to say were important enough to say clearly. She told her about Mr. Aldrich, who had recently lost his second bookkeeper, and might, Cecily thought, be persuaded to give Delia simple work at the counter if she could learn the prices, which Delia could, and did, within a week. She did not tell her it would be easy. It was not easy. But she told her what was true, which was that the first winter was the hardest, and that it got easier not because the problems went away, but because you got stronger than the problems, and that this was a thing that happened without you noticing it. Incrementally, the way a tree grows. You couldn't see it day to day, but one morning you looked and the tree was larger than you remembered, and you were glad. By the time spring came, there were 3 of them: Cecily, Delia, and a woman named Mrs. Holt, who was 58 and had recently buried a husband whose debts had consumed nearly everything they'd owned, and who had come to the boarding house with a small pearl pin, and her late mother's recipe book, and a very precise knowledge of how to make 12 different kinds of cake. The cakes turned out to be significant. Mrs. Patton had been providing only breakfast and supper, and the question of what to offer midday had always been a problem. By April, Mrs. Holt was making cakes and pies in Mrs. Patton's kitchen every morning, which were sold by the slice to the boarders, and to a small number of regular customers, who had begun arriving at the side door, with the particular expression of people who have heard something is good, and want to find out if it's true. Cecily kept the accounts for this arrangement, at Mrs. Patton's request, and discovered that the cake operation was generating enough additional income to cover Mrs. Holt's room entirely, with something left over. She told Mrs. Patton this. Mrs. Patton looked at the figures for a long time and said, "Well, I know," Cecily said. In June, Mr. Hargrove told her that the separation was finalized. She was legally no longer Roland Marsh's wife in any practical sense, though Virginia law would not call it a divorce. It was a separation of property and of legal obligation, which meant she was free to make her own contracts, to earn and keep her own money, to exist in the world as something other than an appendage to a man who had never, not once in 3 years, looked up from his supper. She walked home from Mr. Hargrove's office through the June afternoon, past the dry goods store, where she worked Tuesdays and Fridays, past the boarding house where the side door had a small sign now that Mrs. Patton had agreed to put up cakes and pies daily, past the corner where the oak tree was beginning to show its summer fullness, and she felt the particular feeling she had been slowly accumulating since October, the one that had started as relief and had been, over the months, building itself into something larger and more permanent. She turned into the side yard of the boarding house, where Mrs. Patton's kitchen garden was coming up in neat rows, and she stood for a moment in the afternoon light. She had $34 when she left. She had considerably more than that now. She had work that was hers, a room that was hers, a life that had been built, piece by piece, from what she'd had, which had not been much. She had Delia, who was learning the accounts at the dry goods store, and who had stopped looking at the door every time it opened. She had Mrs. Holt, who had that morning brought her a slice of ginger cake wrapped in paper and set it on her washstand without comment. She had Mrs. Patton, who had asked no unnecessary questions, and had offered her coffee, and had told her about Mr. Aldrich, and who was, Cecily understood now, the specific kind of woman who knew what it meant to build something from very little, and had decided, quietly, to help another woman do the same. She thought about the kitchen at Grayhill, the bread on the board, the kitchen door that was not fully latched. She thought about Roland in his parlor, comfortable and warm, entirely certain that she would come back because she had nowhere else to go. She went inside and sat at the small desk in her room. She had a desk now. She had bought it in March from a man on Aldrich's street, who was moving west and selling what he couldn't take, and she opened the ledger she kept for the boarding house accounts. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote the date, June 14, 1821. Below it, she began to write down what they would need if Mrs. Patton were to add another room. The numbers, as she worked them, made sense. Most things did. She had found, if you were willing to sit with them long enough and look at them clearly. Without flinching, she kept writing until the light was gone, and Mrs. Patton knocked on the door to say supper was ready. She closed the ledger and went down.